The sun was setting over the sprawling Texas wilderness, casting long shadows across the dense forest that stretched as far as the eye could see. Sergeant David Kane adjusted the strap of his rifle and surveyed the landscape from the back of the Black Hawk helicopter as it skimmed the treetops. The mission briefing had been vague, almost too vague for Kane's liking, but that wasn't unusual. Special operations missions often came with more questions than answers. Still, something about this assignment felt off. Even for him. Kane turned to his team, a tight-knit group of 6 Green Berets who had been through hell and back together. Each man was a seasoned warrior, handpicked for their unique skills and unflinching loyalty. There was Mason, the team's sniper, whose sharp eyes could spot a target from miles away. Rivers, the communications expert with a knack for hacking into enemy systems. Morales, the demolition specialist who could build or dismantle a bomb with equal precision. Jackson, the team's medic, always calm under pressure. And finally, Bishop, the close-quarters combat expert, whose silent but deadly efficiency was the stuff of legend. They were brothers in arms, bound by the unspoken trust that came from years of shared combat experience. 5 minutes out, the pilot called back over the roar of the helicopter blades, snapping Kane out of his thoughts. "All right, listen up," Kane said, his voice steady and commanding. "You all read the briefing. We're heading into the middle of nowhere to investigate a series of disappearances. Local law enforcement is stumped, and whatever's out there has them spooked. This isn't a search and rescue, boys. It's a recon. We find out what's going on, gather intel, and report back. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. Understood?" The team nodded in unison, each man checking his gear one last time. There was a tension in the air, an unspoken understanding that this mission was different. None of them said it aloud, but they all felt it. A creeping sense of unease that settled into their bones as the helicopter descended into a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. The rotors kicked up a cloud of dust and debris as the Black Hawk touched down, the team disembarking with practiced efficiency. Kane took point, his rifle at the ready, as they moved quickly to establish a perimeter around the landing zone. The clearing was eerily quiet, the only sounds the rustle of leaves in the wind and the distant call of a lone coyote. "Rivers, get that drone in the air," Kane ordered, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. Rivers nodded, unpacking a compact surveillance drone from his rucksack. Within minutes, the drone was airborne, feeding live video to the small monitor strapped to Rivers' wrist. The feed showed nothing out of the ordinary, just miles of dense forest, undisturbed and seemingly devoid of life. "Nothing on the drone," Rivers reported, his brow furrowed. "No heat signatures, no movement." "Could be they're holed up somewhere," Mason suggested, his eyes fixed on the tree line through the scope of his sniper rifle, "waiting for us to make the first move. Or it's a trap," Bishop added, his voice low and grim. "They know we're coming." Kane considered this, his mind racing through the possibilities. The locals had reported strange lights in the sky, unidentifiable sounds, and, most disturbingly, entire search parties vanishing without a trace. The forest had swallowed them whole, leaving behind only whispers and fear. But fear wasn't something Kane allowed himself to feel. He had a mission, and he intended to see it through. "Stay sharp," Kane said, leading the team into the forest. "Eyes on your sectors. We move fast and quiet." The forest closed in around them as they advanced, the dense underbrush and towering pines blocking out what little light remained. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air was thick with humidity, and the silence was almost unnatural, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. As they moved, Kane couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It wasn't the first time he'd felt this way on a mission, but this was different, more intense, more immediate. He signaled for the team to halt, dropping to one knee as he scanned the area. "Anyone else getting a bad feeling about this?" Jackson whispered, his voice barely audible over the soft rustle of leaves. "Just keep your eyes open," Kane replied, though he shared the sentiment. "We stick to the plan. Recon, gather intel, and get out." They continued deeper into the forest, the light fading fast as night began to fall. The trees grew thicker, their branches intertwining above to form a near-impenetrable canopy. Kane's instincts screamed at him to turn back, but he pushed on, leading his team further into the unknown. After what felt like hours of trudging through the dense underbrush, they came upon a small clearing. In the center was a campsite, tents, a smoldering fire pit, and scattered supplies. But something was wrong. The tents were slashed open, the supplies strewn about as if in a hurry, and there was blood, dark stains on the ground, smeared across the canvas of the tents. "Jesus," Morales muttered, his eyes wide as he took in the scene. "What the hell happened here?" Kane knelt beside the fire pit, examining the ground. The blood was fresh, no more than a day old. But there were no bodies, no signs of what had happened to the people who had been here. "This wasn't an animal attack," Kane said, his voice tight. "These cuts are too clean, too precise. Whatever did this knew what it was doing." "Tracks," Mason called out, pointing to a set of footprints leading away from the camp. They were deep and uneven, as if whoever made them was running or being dragged. Kane's pulse quickened. "We follow the tracks," he ordered. "Stay close and keep your weapons ready." As they followed the trail, the forest seemed to grow darker, the trees closing in around them. The tracks led them further into the wilderness, winding through narrow paths and over rocky terrain. The oppressive silence was broken only by the occasional snap of a twig or rustle of leaves, but it was enough to keep the team on edge. The tracks they had found led away from the site, a trail that seemed to snake deeper into the dense Texan wilderness. But something about the tracks was wrong. They weren't like anything Kane had ever seen in his years of tracking man and beast alike. Mason, the team's sniper and their best tracker, was beside him, his face a mask of concentration as he studied the footprints. "These tracks, they don't make any sense, Sarge," Mason murmured, shaking his head. "It's like whatever made them doesn't walk right. One moment it's on 2 legs, then it's on 4. And here," he pointed to a section where the tracks seemed to abruptly stop and then reappear several feet ahead. "Here, it just vanishes." Kane frowned, the unease from the night before tightening its grip on his gut. "Could it be an ambush?" he asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it from his team. Mason shook his head again. No, this isn't an ambush. This is something else. I've seen animals try to cover their tracks before, but nothing like this. It's almost as if it can phase in and out of our reality. Phasing in and out? Morales, the demolitions expert, let out a low whistle. You mean like some kind of predator? Could be, Mason replied, his tone grim. Or something worse. Kane stood, wiping the sweat from his brow as he considered their options. We need to keep moving. Whatever did this, it's out there, and it's not going to wait for us to catch up. Stay sharp and watch each other's backs. The team nodded in silent agreement, their camaraderie and trust the only thing keeping fear at bay. They set off, following the trail as it wound deeper into the forest. The sun was fully up now, but the thick canopy above allowed only slivers of light to pierce through, casting eerie shadows across the forest floor. As they followed the tracks, the forest seemed to grow more oppressive with each step. The trees, which had been tall and majestic, now loomed over them like sentinels, their branches twisting in unnatural ways. The air was heavy, thick with humidity and the scent of decay. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig underfoot or the distant rustle of leaves. The further they went, the stranger the tracks became. They would follow them for 100 yards, only for the footprints to disappear entirely, leaving no trace of where the creature or creatures had gone. Sometimes the tracks would reappear far ahead, as if whatever was making them had leaped an impossible distance, defying the laws of physics. Jackson, the team's medic, was visibly on edge. This doesn't feel right, Kane. It's like we're chasing a ghost. Kane couldn't disagree. He felt it too, the overwhelming sense that they were being toyed with, led deeper into the forest by something that was always one step ahead. Something that knew the terrain better than they did, and was using it against them. Rivers, who had been monitoring the drone feed on his wrist-mounted screen, suddenly froze. "Sarge, you need to see this," he said, his voice tight. Kane moved to Rivers' side and glanced at the screen. The drone, which had been following their trail from above, was showing a live feed of the tracks they had just been following. But the tracks weren't there. The forest floor was undisturbed, as if no one had passed through at all. "What the hell?" Kane muttered, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew the drone feed was reliable. Rivers had calibrated it himself before they left. But now it was as if the tracks had never existed. Could be some kind of camouflage, Rivers suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. Or we're dealing with something that can cover its tracks as easily as it makes them, Kane replied, his mind racing. Something that doesn't want to be found. They pressed on, moving with renewed caution. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees growing denser, the shadows deeper. Every now and then, Kane would catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of his eye. A flicker of something darting between the trees, too fast to make out. He wasn't the only one. He could see it in the tense expressions of his team, the way their eyes constantly scanned the surrounding foliage, fingers twitching on their triggers. They reached a small stream, the water crystal clear as it babbled over smooth stones. The tracks they had been following led straight to the water's edge and then vanished. Mason knelt beside the stream, running his hand through the water. "Nothing," he said after a moment. No tracks on the other side. No sign that anything crossed here. It's like it just disappeared. Or it's watching us from somewhere we can't see, Bishop said, his voice low and edged with tension. Kane scanned the tree line, every instinct telling him that they were being watched. He could feel eyes on him, could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. "Keep moving," he ordered, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're not stopping until we find out what the hell is going on." They continued upstream, moving as quietly as possible. The forest seemed to grow darker the further they went, the sunlight struggling to break through the thick canopy. The air was stifling, the oppressive silence weighing heavily on them. Every sound, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made their hearts race. Suddenly, Mason held up a hand, signaling for the team to stop. He crouched low, his eyes narrowing as he studied something on the ground. Kane moved to his side, his pulse quickening as he saw what Mason had found. It was a track, just one, half buried in the soft earth. But this track was different. It was larger, deeper, and the shape was unlike any animal track Kane had ever seen. It was almost human, but the toes were elongated, the nails sharp and claw-like. "What the hell made this?" Kane asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," Mason replied, his voice tense. "But whatever it is, it's big, and it's close." A low growl echoed through the trees, the sound so deep it seemed to vibrate through their bones. The team froze, their weapons up, eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. "Rivers? Anything on the drone?" Kane asked, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his insides. "Nothing," Rivers replied, his voice shaking. "The feed's clean. No movement. No heat signatures." Another growl, closer this time. The sound was low, guttural, and filled with an unmistakable malice. Kane's mind raced. They were in over their heads. This was no ordinary mission, and whatever they were up against was far more dangerous than anything they had encountered before. "Back to back," Kane ordered, his voice firm. "We're getting out of here now." The team moved into formation, their backs to each other, weapons trained on the surrounding forest. They began to retreat, moving slowly, carefully, their eyes never leaving the tree line. The growling stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow worse. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then, without warning, the ground beneath them shook. It was subtle at first, just a slight tremor, but it quickly grew in intensity. The earth seemed to pulse, the trees swaying as if caught in a strong wind. "What the hell?" Morales began, but his words were cut off as the ground beneath his feet gave way. "Move," Kane shouted, his voice lost in the chaos as the ground crumbled, the earth collapsing in on itself. The team scattered, leaping away from the collapsing earth as a massive sinkhole opened up beneath them. Kane barely managed to catch himself on the edge, his fingers digging into the loose dirt as he pulled himself to safety. He looked back, his heart racing as he saw the gaping hole in the ground where they had just been standing. The sinkhole was massive, easily 30 feet across, and at the bottom, half buried in the loose dirt, was something that made Kane's blood run cold. It was a tunnel, an ancient, dark passage that led deep underground. The walls were smooth, almost polished, and they were covered in the same strange symbols they had seen on the monolithic structure. But what terrified Kane the most was not the tunnel itself, but the tracks that led into it. The same clawed, inhuman tracks they had been following all morning. "They're coming from below," Mason whispered, his face pale. "Whatever these things are, they're coming from down there." Kane stared into the darkness of the tunnel, the air thick with the scent of decay. He knew they had to go down there, knew that the answers they were seeking lay within those depths. But he also knew that once they entered, there might be no coming back. "We need to regroup," Kane said, his voice steady despite the terror gnawing at him. "We'll set up a perimeter here and assess our options." The team nodded, each man's face set with grim determination. They had been trained for the worst, but nothing could have prepared them for this. As they moved to secure the area, Kane couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that whatever had made those tracks was waiting for them in the darkness below. And as the shadows lengthened and the forest grew darker, Kane knew one thing for certain. This mission had just become a fight for survival, and they were about to face something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The forest was bathed in an unsettling twilight as the team gathered around the edge of the sinkhole, their faces drawn and tense. The discovery of the tunnel beneath the earth had sent a shiver down each of their spines, but the disappearance of Morales had left them shaken to their core. He was their demolitions expert, a steady hand in the most volatile of situations, and now he was gone, swallowed by the earth as if he had never existed. Sergeant David Kane felt the weight of command heavier than ever. Every instinct screamed at him to pull the team out, to regroup and rethink their approach. But they were already in too deep. They had come here for answers, and those answers were now dragging them into the bowels of the earth, one soldier at a time. Mason, their sniper, was the first to speak, his voice low and rough. "We have to find him, Sarge. We can't leave Morales down there alone." Kane nodded, but the unease gnawing at his gut only grew. He had seen too many missions go sideways because of decisions made in the heat of the moment, but leaving a man behind wasn't something he could live with. They were a team, a family. They fought together, and they survived together. "Rivers, Jackson," Kane said, turning to the two men standing closest to him. "Get the rope. We're going down. Mason, Bishop, you're with me. We're not leaving Morales behind." Rivers and Jackson moved quickly, securing a sturdy line to the nearest tree. The sinkhole loomed before them, a gaping maw in the earth, and Kane couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to step into something far beyond their understanding. "Keep your eyes open," Kane warned as he clipped the line to his harness. "We don't know what's down there, and we're not taking any chances." One by one, the team descended into the darkness, the walls of the sinkhole closing in around them. The air grew colder the deeper they went, and the smell of decay became almost overwhelming. Kane's headlamp cut through the gloom, casting eerie shadows on the smooth, polished walls of the tunnel that now surrounded them. The symbols that covered the walls seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly light, and Kane felt a chill run down his spine as he realized they weren't just carvings. They were alive, moving and shifting in the corner of his vision. "Stay sharp," Kane whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of their boots scraping against the stone. "We don't know what's waiting for us down here." The tunnel twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the earth. The walls were tight, the air thick and oppressive, and Kane could feel the weight of the earth pressing down on them, as if the tunnel itself were trying to swallow them whole. "Morales!" Kane called out, his voice echoing eerily off the walls. There was no response, only the suffocating silence of the earth closing in around them. As they pressed on, the tunnel opened up into a larger chamber, and the team paused to take in their surroundings. The chamber was massive, the ceiling lost in shadow, and the walls were lined with more of the pulsing symbols. In the center of the room was a stone altar, covered in the same dark substance they had seen above ground, and lying beside the altar was Morales, unconscious and motionless. "Morales!" Kane sprinted across the chamber, dropping to his knees beside his fallen comrade. Jackson was right behind him, already pulling out his medical kit. "Pulse is weak, but he's alive," Jackson reported, his hands moving quickly and efficiently as he checked Morales for injuries. "Looks like he took a hit to the head. Might have a concussion." Kane let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Morales was alive, but the relief was short-lived. The air in the chamber was thick with tension, the feeling of being watched more intense than ever. Kane's eyes flicked to the walls, where the symbols seemed to writhe in anticipation, and his gut twisted with the knowledge that they weren't alone. "We need to get him out of here," Kane said, his voice tight. "Rivers, can you carry him?" Rivers nodded, slinging his rifle across his back and hoisting Morales over his shoulder. But as they turned to leave, the ground beneath them began to tremble, a low rumble echoing through the chamber. "Move! Now!" Kane barked, urgency lacing his words. The team sprinted for the tunnel, but the tremors grew stronger, the earth shifting beneath their feet. Stones fell from the ceiling, and the walls seemed to close in, the symbols glowing brighter with every passing second. As they reached the tunnel, the chamber behind them exploded in a shower of stone and dust. The team was thrown forward, but they scrambled to their feet, adrenaline driving them as they raced through the twisting passage. But the tunnel was no longer leading them back the way they had come. The path twisted and turned in impossible ways, leading them deeper into the earth. The walls pulsed with that sickly light, and Kane could hear a low, rhythmic sound, like a heartbeat, thudding in his ears. The tunnel opened into another chamber, and the team skidded to a halt, their breaths ragged. This chamber was even larger than the last, the walls covered in even more of the writhing symbols. But this time they weren't alone. Standing in the center of the chamber, illuminated by the pulsing glow of the symbols, was a figure. Tall, gaunt, and impossibly ancient. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and its body was covered in the same dark substance that coated the walls and altar. Kane's blood ran cold as the figure turned its gaze on them. The air seemed to thicken, and Kane could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on them like a physical force. "Rivers, get Morales out of here," Kane ordered, his voice steady despite the terror gnawing at his insides. "Jackson, cover him." The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, as if it were savoring the fear it was invoking. Kane raised his rifle, his finger on the trigger, but he knew, deep down, that bullets wouldn't stop whatever this was. The figure raised a hand, and the ground beneath them trembled once more. The symbols on the walls pulsed with a blinding light, and the air was filled with a high-pitched, keening sound that made Kane's teeth ache. "Move!" Kane shouted, but the words were drowned out by the deafening noise. The teams scattered, each man moving on instinct as the chamber seemed to collapse around them. Kane could see Rivers struggling to carry Morales, could see Jackson firing blindly at the figure, but the light was too bright, the sound too loud. Kane stumbled forward, his vision blurring as the light consumed everything. He reached out, trying to find his team, but all he could feel was the crushing weight of the earth closing in around him. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The light faded, and Kane found himself standing alone in the darkness, the chamber silent and empty. "Rivers? Jackson?" Kane's voice echoed off the walls, but there was no response. He was alone. The chamber was empty, the symbols on the walls dark and lifeless. The figure was gone, and so was his team. Kane's heart pounded in his chest as he staggered forward, his mind racing. He had to find them. He couldn't leave them behind. But as he moved through the darkened tunnel, he realized that the walls were no longer stone. They were soft, almost fleshy, and they pulsed with a faint, sickly light. The symbols were gone, replaced by something far worse. The walls were covered in faces, human faces, twisted in agony, their eyes wide with terror. Their mouths moved soundlessly, as if screaming for help that would never come. Kane stumbled back, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He turned to run, but the tunnel shifted again, the walls closing in around him, the faces pressing against him, their silent screams filling his mind. He ran, not knowing where he was going, only knowing that he had to get away. But no matter how fast he ran, the tunnel stretched on, the faces growing more distorted, more horrific. And then, just as he thought he could run no more, the tunnel opened into a vast, dark cavern. Kane skidded to a halt, his heart pounding in his chest as he took in the sight before him. The cavern was filled with hundreds of those figures, tall, gaunt, and ancient, their eyes glowing with that same malevolent light. They stood in a circle surrounding a massive, pulsating orb of light that hung in the center of the cavern. Kane could feel the pull of the orb, could feel it drawing him in, but he fought against it, his mind screaming in terror. He had to find his team. He had to get out of here. But as he turned to run, he felt a cold hand on his shoulder. He spun around, his breath catching in his throat, as he came face to face with one of the figures. Its eyes bored into his, and Kane felt his mind unraveling, felt the weight of its ancient power crushing him. He tried to fight, tried to break free, but it was too strong. The last thing Kane saw before the darkness consumed him was the figure's eyes, glowing with a sickly, unnatural light, filled with the knowledge of 1,000 lifetimes. And then, there was nothing. The pain was the first thing Kane became aware of when he regained consciousness. A deep, throbbing ache in his head, as though someone had taken a sledgehammer to his skull. He groaned, forcing his eyes open. The world around him was blurred and distorted, but slowly, his vision began to clear. He was lying on the cold, hard ground, surrounded by the eerie silence of the forest. The oppressive darkness from the tunnels had lifted, replaced by the dim light of an overcast sky. For a moment, Kane wondered if he had imagined everything that had happened, But the ache in his bones and the terror lingering in his mind told him otherwise. He sat up slowly, taking in his surroundings. The forest had thinned out, the dense canopy giving way to a more open landscape. But what caught Kane's attention was what lay ahead of him, a small, dilapidated town that seemed to rise out of the mist like a ghost from the past. The buildings were old, their wooden facades weathered and worn, as though they had been standing for centuries. The streets were empty, the windows dark, and the air carried the faint scent of decay. It was as if the town had been abandoned in a hurry, left to rot in the middle of nowhere. Kane's instincts screamed at him to stay away, but he knew he had no choice. He needed answers, and this town, this forgotten place, might hold the key to understanding what had happened to his team, to Morales, to himself. He forced himself to his feet, wincing as pain shot through his legs. He had no idea how far he had traveled from the tunnels, how much time had passed since he blacked out. But the town was the only lead he had, and he wasn't going to leave without getting to the bottom of this nightmare. Kane moved cautiously, his rifle at the ready, as he approached the town. The silence was unnerving, the only sound the crunch of gravel under his boots. As he crossed the threshold into the main street, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the town itself was alive, observing him with unseen eyes. The first building he came across was a general store, its windows shattered, the sign above the door hanging by a single rusty nail. Inside, the shelves were barren, covered in a thick layer of dust. The remains of a cash register sat on the counter, its drawer hanging open, empty. Kane could almost imagine the people who once lived here, going about their lives, unaware of the horrors that were about to consume them. He moved further down the street, passing more buildings, an old saloon with its doors swinging open, a church with its steeple leaning precariously to one side, and a schoolhouse with broken windows and rotting wood. It was as if time had stood still in this place, preserving the town in a state of decay. But what disturbed Kane the most were the strange symbols that adorned the walls of the buildings, the same symbols he had seen in the tunnels, now etched into the wood and stone of the town. They seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive, and Kane couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching him, waiting for him to make a move. He turned a corner and froze. At the end of the street, shrouded in mist, was a large house, once grand, now crumbling and overgrown with vines. It stood out from the rest of the town, its presence looming, ominous. Something about it drew Kane in, a pull he couldn't resist. As he approached, the front door creaked open, as if inviting him inside. Kane hesitated, every instinct telling him to turn back, to leave this cursed place. But he knew he had to go in. He had to find out what had happened here, what had taken his team. He stepped over the threshold, his heart pounding in his chest. The interior of the house was as decrepit as the rest of the town, the walls peeling, the floorboards creaking under his weight. The air was thick with dust and the scent of mold, but there was something else too, a faint metallic odor that sent a chill down Kane's spine. He moved through the rooms, each one more unsettling than the last. The furniture was covered in white sheets, now yellowed with age. Portraits hung crooked on the walls, their subjects staring down at him with cold, empty eyes. But it was the silence that unnerved Kane the most, oppressive, absolute. as if the house itself were holding its breath. He reached a grand staircase that led to the second floor. As he ascended, the creaking of the steps echoed through the house, each sound amplified in the stillness. At the top of the stairs, he found himself in a long hallway, lined with doors that led to what he assumed were bedrooms. But one door at the end of the hall was different, larger, more ornate. It was slightly ajar, and from within, Kane could see a faint light flickering. He approached cautiously, every muscle in his body tense, ready for whatever was waiting on the other side. He pushed the door open with the barrel of his rifle and stepped inside. The room was a study, or what remained of one. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books that had long since rotted away. A large desk sat in the center, covered in papers and strange artifacts that Kane couldn't identify. But it was what lay on the floor in front of the desk that made Kane's blood run cold. A body, dressed in tattered clothing, lay sprawled on the floor, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles. The skin was mummified, the face a rictus of terror, but it was clear this person had been dead for decades, if not longer. But it wasn't the corpse that held Kane's attention. It was the object clutched in its bony hands. An ancient book, its cover made of some dark, weathered leather, the same symbols etched into it that adorned the walls of the town. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with writing that Kane couldn't understand. But he knew instinctively that this book held the answers he sought. As Kane reached for the book, the temperature in the room seemed to drop, the air growing colder, heavier. The symbols on the walls began to pulse with that sickly light, casting eerie shadows across the room. The moment Kane's fingers touched the book, the house seemed to come alive. The walls groaned, the floorboards creaked, and the air was filled with a low humming sound that Kane felt deep in his bones. He pulled the book free from the corpse's grasp, and as he did, the room was plunged into darkness. The only light came from the pulsing symbols, now glowing brighter, more violently. Kane's heart raced as he realized he had triggered something ancient and powerful. He opened the book, flipping through the pages, his hands trembling. The writing was in a language he didn't recognize, but the images, grotesque, horrifying images, told him everything he needed to know. This town had been a place of sacrifice, a place where dark rituals were performed to summon and bind the very creatures that had taken his team. The townspeople had worshipped them, made offerings to them, and in return, they were granted power. Power that had come at a terrible cost. But something had gone wrong. The rituals had failed, the creatures had turned on their worshippers, and the town had been consumed, left to rot and decay under the weight of its own sins. And now Kane and his team had stumbled into this cursed place, and the creatures were hungry once more. Kane slammed the book shut, the realization hitting him like a freight train. They had walked into a trap set by forces far beyond their understanding. And now they were part of the ritual, a new sacrifice for the creatures that lurked in the darkness. The humming grew louder, the walls vibrating with energy. Kane knew he had to get out, had to warn his team, had to escape this nightmare before it was too late. He turned to leave, but the door slammed shut, trapping him inside. The room began to shake, dust falling from the ceiling as the house groaned under the weight of the dark energy that had been unleashed. Kane grabbed the book, tucking it under his arm as he ran to the window. He smashed it with the butt of his rifle, sending shards of glass flying. Without a second thought, he climbed out, dropping to the ground below. He hit the dirt hard, the impact jarring his already battered body, but he forced himself to his feet. The town was different now, no longer empty, no longer silent. Shadows moved between the buildings, figures watching him from the darkness, their eyes glowing with that sickly, unnatural light. Kane didn't wait to see what they would do. He ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he sprinted down the main street, past the decaying buildings, past the symbols that seemed to mock him with their twisted, shifting forms. He didn't stop until he was out of the town, the oppressive weight of it lifting as he crossed the threshold into the forest. But even then, he knew he wasn't safe. The shadows were still there, still watching, still waiting. Kane kept running, his mind racing as he tried to piece together what he had learned. The book was the key. He was sure of it. It held the answers he needed to survive, to save his team, to stop whatever was coming for them. But he also knew that time was running out. The creatures were awake now, and they wouldn't rest until they had claimed their sacrifice. As Kane pushed deeper into the forest, the town fading into the mist behind him, he vowed to do whatever it took to stop them, to end this nightmare once and for all. But in the back of his mind, a voice whispered, a voice that sounded suspiciously like his own, telling him that it was already too late. The darkness had already claimed them, and there was no escape. The forest seemed to close in around Kane as he made his way back to the sinkhole, the ancient book clutched tightly against his chest. The daylight was fading fast, and with it, the thin veneer of safety that the sun had provided. The shadows lengthened, creeping across the forest floor like tendrils of darkness, reaching out for him. He could feel the oppressive weight of the knowledge he carried, a burden that threatened to crush him under its significance. Kane knew that whatever was down there in the depths of the earth, it was connected to the old town and the rituals that had taken place there. The book had shown him enough to make that clear, but it had also hinted at something far worse, an ancient power that had been lying dormant, waiting for the right moment to awaken. And now, it was awake. He could feel it pulsing beneath the ground, a malevolent presence that seemed to throb in time with his own heartbeat. The air was thick with tension, and every step he took felt like a march toward an inevitable, horrific confrontation. When he finally reached the sinkhole, he was relieved to see that the team's equipment was still there. Ropes, packs, and the remnants of their initial camp. But the relief was short-lived. The sinkhole was darker than before, the abyss yawning wide like the maw of some great beast, eager to swallow him whole. Kane hesitated at the edge, peering into the darkness below. He had already lost contact with Morales, Rivers, and Jackson. Mason and Bishop were still out there somewhere, but without communications, Kane was on his own. The thought of descending into that darkness alone was almost unbearable, but Kane knew he had no choice. His men were down there, and it was his duty to bring them back, or to finish what they had started. He clipped the rope to his harness, testing the weight. The knot held firm, but the sense of foreboding didn't ease. Kane took a deep breath, steadied himself, and began his descent. The rope creaked under his weight as he lowered himself into the sinkhole, his headlamp slicing through the darkness in thin, narrow beams. The walls of the sinkhole, once smooth and featureless, now seemed to pulse with life, shifting in the corner of his vision. He forced himself to focus, inching his way down with deliberate care. As he descended, the air grew colder, the scent of decay and earth thickening around him. The hum he had felt earlier was stronger now, reverberating through the rock and into his bones. It was as if the very ground beneath him was alive, throbbing with some ancient malevolent power. His feet touched down on solid ground, and Kane unhooked the rope, his senses on high alert. The tunnel that lay before him was narrow, the walls pressing in on either side. The pulsing symbols were back, etched into the stone, their sickly glow casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. Kane moved forward, his rifle raised, every step echoing in the confined space. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning, leading him deeper into the earth. The walls were damp, slick with a dark, viscous substance that Kane recognized from the town. It was the same substance that had coated the altar, the same one that seemed to seep from the very pores of the earth. As he ventured deeper, the hum grew louder, the vibrations stronger, until it felt like the ground itself was alive, pulsing with some unseen energy. Kane's heart pounded in his chest, the sound nearly drowned out by the rhythmic thudding in his ears. He came to a fork in the tunnel, one path leading to the left, the other to the right. Both were equally dark, equally foreboding. Kane hesitated, his mind racing. He had no idea which path to take, no way of knowing where his men might be. But as he stood there, trying to decide, he heard it. A faint sound, almost drowned out by the hum. It was a voice, distant, muffled, but unmistakably human. Kane's heart leaped in his chest. It was Rivers. He was sure of it. The voice was coming from the left tunnel. Without hesitation, Kane turned and headed in that direction, moving as quickly as the narrow passage would allow. The tunnel twisted and turned, the walls closing in, the air growing colder with each step. But the voice grew louder, more distinct. Kane could hear it now, Rivers' voice calling out, filled with desperation and fear. "Rivers!" Kane shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. "Rivers, I'm coming!" The voice didn't respond, but Kane pushed forward, the tunnel finally opening up into a larger chamber. His headlamp swept across the room, revealing a horrific sight. Rivers was there, lying on the ground, his body twisted in pain, but alive. He was pinned beneath a massive slab of stone, his face pale and slick with sweat. Beside him lay Jackson, unconscious, a deep gash on his forehead, blood staining the ground beneath him. But it wasn't the sight of his fallen comrades that made Kane's blood run cold. It was the creature standing over them. The thing was massive, towering over Rivers and Jackson, its form a grotesque amalgamation of flesh and shadow. Its body was humanoid, but twisted and malformed, with limbs too long, fingers ending in sharp, jagged claws. Its face was a nightmare, a gaping maw filled with rows of jagged teeth, eyes glowing with a sickly, unnatural light. Kane froze, his mind screaming at him to run, to get as far away from that thing as possible. But he couldn't leave his men, not like this. He raised his rifle, aiming for the creature's head, his finger tightening on the trigger. The creature's head snapped up, its glowing eyes locking onto Kane. For a moment, time seemed to freeze, the hum in the air growing louder, vibrating through Kane's skull. Then the creature moved faster than Kane could react. It lunged at him, its claws slashing through the air, and Kane barely had time to dive to the side, the creature's claws missing him by inches. Kane rolled to his feet, firing his rifle in a controlled burst. The bullets slammed into the creature's chest, but it didn't slow down. It was on him again in an instant, its claws tearing through his gear, slashing at his arms and chest. Kane grunted in pain, but he didn't stop. He fired again, aiming for the creature's head, but it was too fast, too powerful. The creature swiped at him, and Kane felt the air leave his lungs as he was thrown across the chamber, slamming into the wall with bone-rattling force. His vision blurred, the room spinning around him, but Kane forced himself to stay conscious. He couldn't let this thing win. He couldn't let it take him, too. He struggled to his feet, pain radiating through his body, but the creature was already on him again, its claws raised for the killing blow. Desperation fueled Kane's actions as he reached for his belt, grabbing a flashbang grenade. He pulled the pin and hurled it at the creature, just as its claws descended. The grenade exploded in a blinding flash of light and sound, the shockwave throwing the creature back with a screech of pain. Kane shielded his eyes, the noise deafening, but he didn't waste a moment. He lunged for Rivers, grabbing him under the arms and dragging him away from the creature. Rivers groaned in pain, but he was conscious, his eyes wide with fear. Sarge, it's not human. I know, Kane grunted, pulling him toward the tunnel. We have to move now. Jackson was still unconscious, and Kane knew he couldn't carry them both. He had to make a choice, and it was a choice that tore at him. But he couldn't leave Rivers behind, not when there was still a chance to save him. The creature was already recovering, its twisted form writhing as it prepared to strike again. Kane hauled Rivers into the tunnel, firing blindly over his shoulder to keep the creature at bay. The tunnel was narrow, forcing them to move single file, and Kane knew they were at a disadvantage. The creature would come after them. It wouldn't stop until they were all dead. But as they moved deeper into the tunnel, Kane felt something shift in the air. The walls seemed to close in around them, the hum growing louder, more intense. Kane's vision blurred, the tunnel twisting in ways that defied logic, and he knew they were no longer in the world they knew. This was the heart of the darkness, the place where the ancient rituals had taken place, where the creatures had been summoned. This was where it had all begun, and this was where it would end. The tunnel opened up into a vast chamber, and Kane stopped dead in his tracks. The chamber was massive, the walls lined with those same pulsating symbols. But this time, they were brighter, more intense. And at the center of the chamber was an altar, covered in the same dark, viscous substance. But it wasn't the altar that held Kane's attention. It was the massive, pulsating orb of light that hung above it, suspended in midair. The orb was the source of the hum, the source of the power that had drawn them here, and Kane knew it was the key to everything. The creature roared behind them, the sound echoing through the chamber, and Kane knew they were out of time. He turned to Rivers, who was barely conscious, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Rivers," Kane said, his voice urgent. "You have to hold on just a little longer. We're going to end this." Rivers nodded weakly, his eyes filled with fear and pain. But there was a glimmer of hope there, too. He trusted Kane, and Kane couldn't let him down. He pulled the book from his pack, flipping through the pages as the symbols on the walls pulsed in time with the orb. The writing was in a language he didn't understand, but the images were clear. Images of the rituals, of the sacrifices, of the creatures that had been summoned. And there, in the center of the book, was the image of the orb, surrounded by symbols that Kane now recognized as a binding ritual. The hum grew louder, the ground shaking beneath him. But Kane didn't hesitate. He placed the book on the altar, the pages open to the ritual, and began to chant the words written there, his voice trembling but determined. The orb pulsed brighter, the symbols on the walls glowing with a blinding light. The air was thick with energy, and Kane could feel the power building, the ritual taking hold. But the creature wasn't going to let them go without a fight. It roared again, lunging for Kane with its claws outstretched. Kane kept chanting, his voice rising above the hum, above the creature's roars, above the terror that threatened to overwhelm him. The creature reached the altar, its claws slashing at Kane, but the moment they touched him, the orb flared with a blinding light, and the creature screamed in agony. The ritual was working. The binding was taking hold. Kane pushed forward, chanting louder, faster, as the light from the orb grew brighter, enveloping the chamber in its glow. The creature thrashed and writhed, its form twisting and distorting, but it couldn't break free. The orb pulled it in, the light consuming it, drawing it into the center of the ritual. And then, with one final, deafening roar, the creature was gone, sucked into the orb, its twisted form dissolved into nothingness. The light flared one last time, then faded, the chamber plunging into darkness. Kane stood there, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the book still open on the altar. The hum had stopped, the ground was still, and the symbols on the walls were dark, lifeless. It was over. Kane turned to Rivers, who was lying on the ground, his face pale but alive. "We did it," Kane said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's over." But even as he said the words, a nagging doubt crept into his mind. They had stopped the creature. They had completed the ritual. But at what cost? And more importantly, was it truly over? Kane pushed the thought aside. They had to get out of here, had to regroup, find Bishop and Mason, and get the hell out of this nightmare. But as they moved to leave the chamber, Kane couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching them, that the darkness wasn't done with them yet. The forest was unnervingly quiet as Kane emerged from the tunnel, Rivers leaning heavily on his shoulder. The oppressive darkness of the subterranean world clung to them like a shroud, even as they stepped into the cold, open air. The trees around them, twisted and gnarled, seemed to close ranks, as if forming a barrier against whatever lay beyond. Kane could feel it, the malevolent presence that had chased them up from the depths, a force that was not yet finished with them. Rivers' breath came in ragged gasps, his body weak from the ordeal. "Sarge, do you think it's really over?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might summon the horrors they had just escaped. Kane didn't answer right away. His eyes scanned the tree line, every shadow a potential threat. He wanted to tell Rivers it was over, that they had won. But the words caught in his throat. Something wasn't right. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, the same gnawing dread that had been with him since they first set foot in this cursed forest. "No," Kane finally said, his voice low, laced with the tension he couldn't hide. "It's not over. Not yet." Rivers looked up at him, fear and exhaustion etched into his features. "What do we do?" Kane tightened his grip on his rifle, his resolve hardening. "We find Bishop and Mason. We finish this." The two men moved cautiously through the forest, every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves setting their nerves on edge. The night was descending quickly, the last remnants of daylight fading, and with it came the sense of being hunted. Kane knew they had to move fast. Whatever ancient evil they had disturbed wasn't going to let them go so easily. As they trudged through the dense underbrush, the silence grew heavier, more oppressive. Kane's mind raced, replaying everything they had encountered: the tunnels, the town, the creature, the ritual. He knew now that they had only scratched the surface of something far more ancient and terrifying than they had ever imagined. And then, through the thickening gloom, they heard it. A low, mournful howl that seemed to resonate from deep within the earth. It was a sound that sent a shiver down Kane's spine, a primal call that echoed with a promise of death. Rivers froze, his eyes wide with fear. What the hell was that? Kane didn't have an answer, but he knew they were running out of time. The ritual might have stopped one creature, but the evil they had awoken was far from vanquished. If anything, it was growing stronger. They pushed on, the howls growing louder, closer, until they burst into a small clearing, their breath coming in desperate gasps. And there, at the center of the clearing, they found them, Bishop and Mason, or what was left of them. Mason lay sprawled on the ground, his body broken and lifeless, his eyes staring blankly into the void. Bishop was on his knees beside him, his hands covered in blood, his face a mask of anguish and horror. "Bishop!" Kane shouted, rushing forward, his heart pounding in his chest. But as he drew closer, he saw the madness in Bishop's eyes, the wild, feral look of a man pushed beyond the brink. "They're coming, Kane," Bishop muttered, his voice trembling. "We can't stop them. They're everywhere. In the trees, in the ground. They're coming for us." Kane knelt beside him, grabbing his shoulders, trying to shake him back to reality. "Bishop, we need to move. We need to get out of here. Now." But Bishop didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the tree line, where the shadows seemed to writhe and twist with unnatural energy. The howls were closer now, the forest alive with movement, and Kane knew they were surrounded. "We can't run, Kane," Bishop whispered, his voice filled with resignation. "They won't let us go. This is their world. We're just intruders." Kane's grip tightened, the fear gnawing at his insides, but he couldn't afford to lose control now. "We're soldiers, Bishop. We fought worse than this. We get out of here together. We fight, and we survive." Bishop's eyes flicked to Kane's, and for a moment there was a flicker of recognition, of the man Kane had served with for years. But it was fleeting, replaced by a deep, overwhelming terror. "They're here," Bishop said, his voice hollow, and Kane turned just in time to see the first of them emerge from the darkness. The creature was even more terrifying than the one they had faced below. Its body was a mass of writhing tendrils and claws, its eyes glowing with an unnatural, malevolent light. It moved with a speed and grace that belied its size, its form shifting and distorting as it approached. Kane fired his rifle, the shots echoing through the clearing, but the bullets seemed to have little effect. The creature surged forward, its tendrils lashing out, and Kane barely had time to roll out of the way, dragging Rivers with him. Bishop stood his ground, his rifle raised, but Kane knew it was futile. The creature was upon him in an instant, its tendrils wrapping around his body, lifting him off the ground. Bishop screamed, a sound of pure agony, as the creature tore into him, its form melding with his, consuming him from the inside out. Kane fired again, his heart hammering in his chest, but he knew it was too late. Bishop was gone, his body absorbed into the creature, his screams silenced as the forest seemed to close in around them. Rivers was barely conscious, his strength fading fast, but Kane refused to give up. He grabbed Rivers, hauling him to his feet, and they staggered toward the tree line, away from the horror unfolding behind them. But the creatures were everywhere now, emerging from the shadows, their forms twisted and grotesque, their eyes glowing with that same sickly light. They were surrounded, no way out, the forest alive with the nightmare they had unleashed. Kane's mind raced, his thoughts a blur of fear and desperation. There had to be a way out. There had to be something he could do. And then, as if in answer to his unspoken plea, he felt it. The book, still tucked in his pack, pulsing with a faint, rhythmic energy. The ritual. It wasn't finished. The creature below was bound, but the others were still free, still feeding on the power that had been unleashed. But there was a way to stop them. There had to be. Kane pulled the book from his pack, flipping through the pages as the creatures closed in, their forms shifting and merging with the darkness. The symbols glowed faintly, the words almost indecipherable, but Kane knew what he had to do. "Rivers," he said, his voice shaking but resolute. "We have to finish the ritual. It's the only way." Rivers nodded weakly, his eyes filled with fear and trust. He had followed Kane into hell and back, and now he was ready to follow him one last time. Kane began to chant, his voice rising above the howls of the creatures, above the fear that threatened to consume him. The symbols on the pages pulsed with light, growing brighter with each word, each syllable a step closer to the end. The creatures hesitated, their forms flickering as if the ritual was holding them back, binding them. But they were strong, too strong, and Kane knew he was running out of time. He needed more power, more energy, something to tip the scales in their favor. And then he knew. The sacrifice. It had been there all along, hidden in the pages, the final act of the ritual. To bind the creatures, to seal them away forever, a life had to be given. A life for a life. It was the only way. Kane's heart pounded in his chest, the realization hitting him like a freight train. There was no other way out. If they were going to stop this, if they were going to survive, someone had to stay behind. He looked at Rivers, who was barely holding on, his body broken and weak. Rivers had followed him into this nightmare, had trusted him to get them out. But Kane knew what had to be done. "Rivers," Kane said, his voice filled with a calm he didn't feel. "You need to go. You need to get out of here." Rivers looked at him, confusion and fear in his eyes. "What? No, Sarge, I'm not leaving you." "You have to," Kane insisted, the weight of the decision crushing him. "I'll finish the ritual. I'll keep them back. But you need to go. You need to survive." Rivers shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. "No, I can't. I won't leave you." Kane grabbed him by the shoulders, forcing him to understand. "Listen to me. This is the only way. If you stay, we both die. But if you go, you can get out. You can tell them what happened here. You can stop this from happening again." Rivers was crying now, his body trembling with emotion, but he knew Kane was right. "I can't do it, Sarge. I can't leave you." Kane pulled him into a hug, holding him tight, the last vestige of warmth in a world gone cold. "You can. You have to." Rivers sobbed against him, but he nodded, the acceptance of the inevitable in his eyes. "I'll make it count, Sarge. I swear I will." Kane released him, pushing him toward the tree line. "Go, now, and don't look back." Rivers hesitated, but then he turned and ran, his form disappearing into the shadows of the forest, leaving Kane alone in the clearing, surrounded by the creatures that had come to claim him. Kane turned back to the book, his voice rising in a final, desperate chant. The symbols glowed brighter, the light blinding, and Kane could feel the power building, the ritual reaching its climax. The creatures lunged at him, their forms twisting and writhing, but Kane held his ground, the light from the book enveloping him, shielding him from their claws. Kane took a deep breath, his mind calm, at peace. He had made his choice, and he would see it through. With one final, thunderous shout, Kane completed the ritual, the light exploding outward, engulfing the clearing, the creatures, and Kane himself. The world dissolved into pure, blinding light, the sound of the creatures' roars drowned out by the deafening silence of the void. And then, nothing. The light faded, and the forest was still. The creatures were gone, their forms dissolved into the ether, their power bound, sealed away by the ritual. But Kane was gone too. Rivers staggered out of the forest, his body weak, his mind numb. But he was alive. He had made it out. He had survived. And as he looked back at the forest, at the place where Kane had made his final stand, he knew that his sergeant had saved them all. But the cost had been great, too great. Rivers collapsed to his knees, the weight of it all crashing down on him, and he wept, tears of grief, of loss, of relief. He wept for his friends, for his brothers, for the men who had fought beside him and who would never see the light of day again. But most of all, he wept for Kane. Because in the end, Kane had given everything. He had sacrificed his own life to stop the nightmare, to protect the world from the darkness that had threatened to consume it. And Rivers knew that he would carry that burden for the rest of his life. But he would also carry the memory of Kane, of the man who had led them into hell and who had brought them back, who had fought until the very end, who had never given up. And as he stood there in the shadow of the forest, Rivers made a promise to honor Kane's sacrifice, to remember the men they had lost, and to never let the darkness win. Because that was what Kane would have wanted. The final stand had been made, The battle fought, and the nightmare ended. But the story wasn't over. It would live on in the memories of those who survived, in the echoes of the forest, in the pages of the ancient book that now lay buried beneath the earth, and in the hearts of the men who had fought and died to save the world from the darkness